Hey folks, it is March the 2nd, and this is our B-Day U.S. History class. And we're going to pick up where we left off on the Vietnam War. And so just keep in mind, if you have something that's late or missing, make sure you have it in before Friday, because that's the last day that we teachers are allowed to put grades into the grade book before the report cards come out. Next week is going to be spring break, so there won't be a stream. And I've posted on the Google Classroom the calendar for our school regarding whether it's an A day or a B day. So if you ever get confused, you can go in there and you can see what day it is. So, here, let's go ahead and get this loaded up. So I think you remember those guys.
Oh, yeah.
So, last time we were talking about essentially things were escalating really hard into a full-blown national conflict in the Vietnam War. We were throwing everything we had against the Viet Cong. And their whole goal and objective was to grind us down by making us keep fighting until we got tired of it. And they did not care how many people they lost in the process. We were there throwing like $100,000 bombs at them, and they didn't really care. They had as many people as they could want. They were being aided by both the Chinese and the Soviets in war supplies, and also munitions, food, and education for fighting these wars. So they had advisors. So it wasn't just us against the Vietnamese, though they were the ones we were fighting against. So
one of the famous Vietnam song? It's like a famous song in the Vietnam War.
There's a lot of them. What, Fortunate Son?
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, yeah. I think that's great Clearwater. So, there's going to be a lot of new things used in this war. Things like, napalm was around before this. We used it in World War II. But essentially, it's where they're like barrel bombs filled with a petroleum-based substance that will stick to things and catch on fire. This was mostly used for deforestation, like to clear out parts of the jungle, though sometimes it was used as a weapon, and sometimes innocent people would be caught in the middle of this stuff and get burnt pretty bad. Of course, we also used another deforestation chemical called Agent Orange. That's possibly been linked to forms of cancer, like in our troops and stuff later on. Like a lot of lessons learned from from the Korean War and, of course, World War II were applied to this. But neither one of those wars were suited in the same kind of environment as this one. So the U.S. forces had to learn as they could win. But the enemy was very tenacious, and it dragged on and on. Though most Americans supported the war in 1964 in its early years, and a couple of years later, an anti-war movement coalesced around pacifists, those are people who don't want to fight, liberals, and people who did not want to be called up in the draft. So you're having essentially a coalition of people who might have different ideas on the war, but they all understand that they don't want to take part in it. The most vocal protesters were often college students who had little possibility of serving as frontline troops, as most of the frontline troops were either poor or minorities. But they still didn't want to get involved because either, like we've seen before, they had internal moral objections to it, or, going to war is dangerous. People don't want to die for no reason. So,
right.
The FBI made the public aware that some of the anti-war groups were actually aided by communists in order to shape American interests. So though many of these folks who are against the Vietnam War had their own personal reasons to do so, some of the organizations that were against the war were actually being aided by our country's enemies. But this is something that definitely it went on a lot in the Cold War. Each side would have spies trying to control and manipulate the people within their enemy's country. You could say it still happens today, possibly. By 1967, the U.S. military presence in Vietnam increased to over 500,000 troops. The American public would become even more anti-war after the Tet Offensive. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we see that we are dumping a whole lot of money into the Vietnam War. A lot of Americans couldn't explain why we were there specifically. A lot of people didn't know where Vietnam even was on a map. Was
So
part of
it was
criticism.
like they didn't know what they were fighting for.
Yeah, and that was a big problem. That was a
Like
big
that's like the only one I was like really confused about. Like I understand World War One, World War Two,
Mhm.
but the Vietnam and the Korean War, I'm like, why?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, a lot of it was politics. We wanted to stop the spread of communism because we were afraid it'd go everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's not as simple as being attacked and retaliated.
Now I understand the Korean War.
So we just didn't want it to spread. But a lot of people were like, well, who cares what happens over there? You know, like I said, like who cares? That's way over there. So that's out of the world.
Maybe that's something for me.
Yeah. But a lot of people though, once we did get involved, and I've heard this from veterans from like Iraq, they're like, well, you can't pull out of there because we made a lot of friends over there, and a lot of people who were Vietnamese helped us, and so they knew that once we pulled out, they were dead. You know, they joined our side. Everybody knew who they were, and their families would probably get killed too. Same thing happened in Iraq. They were scared that once we left, a lot of those people who helped us would be dead. And if you know anything about recent history with ISIS and stuff, that may have come true. So it's kind of like you go there and then you get stuck. So there we go on to the next one.
Yes.
Okay. We're not going to do too many of these today. We're going to save some for Thursday. What are those? I don't know what that is. Looks like batteries like chained together. All right. So the Tet Offensive began in January of 1968 as the Viet Cong attacked over 40 South Vietnamese cities, and this was all at once out of the middle of nowhere. Our forces had their guard down. We weren't expecting this, and when it happened all at once, it was they overran a lot of our allies. American and South Vietnamese forces recaptured each city, however, in grueling urban combat. And fighting in a city is usually the most slow paced. You have to be very thorough. It's very dangerous. It's very hard to do it without endangering the lives of civilians. And so it's just really tough fighting. This led to the death of 10,000 civilians, 5,000 Viet Cong, and nearly 400 South Vietnamese and 216 Americans in just one city alone. Though the U.S. won these battles, images and newsreels of American wounded and civilian deaths flooded American television screens. So this is known as the first televised war. So people back home in America were watching news stories about all this stuff happening. In wars prior to this, we had recorded movies of what was going on, documentaries and stuff, but the government kept very tight control over footage that came out of places like World War II and, of course, the Korean War. A lot of this was to make sure that people didn't turn against the wars, right? This one, however, lots of stuff was coming out to Americans, and people were watching this, and they would see images of children who had accidentally been burnt by American bombs, or just like caskets with flags over them of like soldiers getting killed and stuff. So it was very, very effective in that way. More Americans wanted the war to be over as time went on, leading President Johnson to seek an end to it. In 1968, the next presidential campaign was in full swing as the Democratic Party, which was Johnson's party, faced divisions so deep that they had a riot at their own convention. And so, before you have a presidential race, you have a convention. And at that convention is when a political party picks who their candidate's going to be. And so the Democratic Party was having a lot of divisions because you had the Southern Democrats who still had those old ideas of Jim Crow and stuff like that against some of the new Democrats who are coming up, who are a bit more like in line with what you might think of as kind of like the hippie movement and stuff. And when you think about it, those two groups of people really don't have a lot in common. But the hippie movement, the anti-war movement, was very, very upset with how the politicians were going. So this was not a period of like great peace. Yeah, I haven't read it in a while, but it used to be my favorite war books were always Vietnam War books. I always liked reading about that. I mean, I read some about like
As a kid or still?
when I was growing up. I didn't really read that many of those when I was a kid. I read a lot of fiction books and stuff like that when I was a kid. I didn't read nonfiction until I grew up.
So one of the Korean War was to help the South Koreans from being a communist country from it's called
The Kims.
December.
Yeah. Yeah, and it worked for half the country, and like Korea now, the southern part, it's one of the most advanced countries in the world.
Advanced, you mean like technical or like
Technical, their lives are all right, good education and
Oh, I gotta go there.
But North Korea is still like the Middle Ages, they got
Yeah,
people
they're like
eating
the
grass.
16th century, yeah.
It's not good. So, I mean, they have computers, but they don't have power to power their computers.
It's like our computers, like where it's managed by the teachers and we can't do anything.
It's worse than that
Yeah,
over there, because they'll put you in a death camp. All right, so because Johnson's party was having so much chaos, there were a lot of people blamed the Vietnam War on the Democrats. They blamed it on Kennedy and Johnson and all that. So American people, usually when they're mad at one party, what do? We switch to the other party. And so here we have the ex-vice president, President Nixon, is going to take office. And so Richard Nixon. President Eisenhower's former vice president, Richard Nixon, became the Republican candidate in the 1968 election. And he called himself the law and order candidate. Because remember, during Johnson, there was all these race riots. Their party commission had these riots. There was just the crime rate was going through the roof in America. And a lot of people wanted stability again. And of course, a lot of people too were very frightened and like bothered by like the counterculture movement, which was trying to break away from social norms that people had in the past regarding like religion, marriage, and stuff like that. He vowed to return America back to its social norms while denouncing pot, porn, protesters, and permissiveness, all while promising to end the war in Vietnam. So people were like, we could turn the clock back. Let's do that. Nixon won the presidency against a Democratic Party that had broken into two separate candidates. And that's what happens when a party divides itself, that party's going to lose. That's how Lincoln got in the office. His main opponent's party broke in half, and so he slid in. That's how Bill Clinton got in the office. The Republicans split in half, and so he slid in. And so this is how this worked out for him too. So with his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, Nixon looked for a way out of Vietnam while improving relations with both the Russians and the Chinese. So Kissinger was I don't know. He's a German born diplomat. Remember, a Secretary of State is somebody who's like your lead ambassador. He's the one who helps you out with foreign relations if you're a president. And so they wanted to calm things down in the Cold War, get us out of Vietnam, but make sure that the Chinese and the Russians aren't always mad at us. The policy to leave Vietnam was known as Vietnamization, and that meant let the Vietnamese people take care of their own military stuff. You start letting them do more, and we do less, and then we get out of there. So, yeah, that was the plan. We're going to see he's going to do a little something else too, hoping that it'll help him out. All right, y'all about ready for the last one? Okay, I'll let you finish that. All right, so, you see this picture here? One of the problems that they had in Vietnam is this place called Cambodia. So Cambodia said they were going to stay out of the war and they were going to be neutral. So that meant, since they were a neutral country, we were not allowed to send troops or attack them or anything like that. Problem is they secretly held bases that would help out the Vietnamese. And so the Vietnamese could come and hide here and stay safe, train their troops, keep supplies, and then send them back over. So because they were neutral, we Americans wanted to leave them alone. However, because they were doing all this stuff and like helping out the enemy and prolonging the war, we wanted to do something about that. The same thing happens today in Afghanistan. We have troops in Afghanistan, but the country next door to the West, Pakistan, is neutral and supposedly one of our allies. But forces like the Taliban and Al Qaeda train there, keep supplies, and let their little soldiers go in and out that direction. And so it makes things prolonged and it helps out the guerrilla fighters, but it hurts our forces. So history kind of repeats itself. Mm-hmm. So Nixon began to reduce the numbers of U.S. troops in Vietnam because remember, he said, I'm getting us out of there, but he wished to negotiate for peace from a position of strength. He didn't want to get out of there and be like, okay, you guys won, just leave us alone. In 1970, Nixon ordered the military to enter Cambodia, that neutral country, and destroy the communist bases there that had provided years of support to the North Vietnamese. It's like, you know what? Gloves are off. Just go get them. Though the Americans won this, the public in the U.S. turned against the president, as Cambodia was not technically at war with the United States. The Senate went as far as to remove war powers from Nixon, And that's a big deal because the president is the one who's supposed to be in charge of the military, but Congress determines whether we're at war or not. And so by 1973, Nixon and Kissinger conducted peace negotiations with the Vietnamese in Paris and declared peace with honor. So it took a while, but they eventually got us out of Vietnam. But we're going to see when we come back Thursday, that doesn't mean everything was all roses when we left. So that's going to cut it for today. We're going to see a little bit more about Vietnam and Richard Nixon when we come back on Thursday and all that good stuff. And then we'll move on to Carter and Reagan after spring break. All right, kids, talk to you later.